Whiteboard partner in Thompson Hine's Investment Management Practice Group. This is the fourth webinar in our weekly coffee chat series. These short and practical discussions focus on a variety of developments that impact the financial services industry. Joining me today is my colleague, Andy Colon. Andy is the Chief Talent Officer at Thompson Hine. In today's session, Andy and I will explore how using behavioral interview process can help a mutual fund board recruit and retain successful and high-performing directors while renewing its commitment to racial and ethnic diversity. If you have any questions or comments during today's program, we encourage you to join the discussion by using the Q&A box on your control panel. We'll address your comments as we move through our discussion, and we'll also try to leave some time at the end for questions. If we don't get to your question, don't worry, we'll follow up after the program. Okay, so let's get started. In last week's coffee chat, my colleague Mark Miner and Tracy Stewart from the Florida State Board of Administration discussed NASDAQ's proposed requirement that most NASDAQ-listed companies have at least 2 diverse directors, including one who self-identifies as female and one who self-identifies as either an underrepresented minority or LGBTQ. Today's topic also will focus on board diversity, but we'll be focusing on investment company boards rather than public company boards. Many studies have shown that companies with boards that embrace gender, ethnic, racial, and cultural diversity tend to be better positioned for sustainable financial success. A more diverse board encourages diversity of thought. Individuals with similar backgrounds tend to think similarly, while those with different backgrounds can bring new ideas that stimulate a board's creativity. Lack of diversity is a long-term risk, and profitable companies tend to mitigate long-term risks. Let's think about this in the investment context. Many mutual fund portfolio managers adhere to modern portfolio theory, which provides that a diversified portfolio will, on average, generate higher returns with lower risk than a less diversified portfolio. In a recent article, the chair of the John Hancock Funds, who also happens to be a retired associate professor of finance and public policy at Boston College, applied modern portfolio theory to fund boards. He argues in his article that risk assessment and risk oversight by a diverse board should result in potentially higher returns. To support his argument, he points to a Goldman Sachs study that indicated that among 500 large cap mutual funds, the performance of funds with at least 1/3 of manager positions held by women beat the performance of funds with no women managers by 1% for the first 8 months of 2020. So it appears that diverse management, including a diverse board, can impact fund performance. Today we'll look at one method investment companies can use to recruit diverse boards. As I mentioned earlier, I'm joined today by Andy Colon. Andy is Thompson Hine's Chief Talent Officer. Andy, along with Nirvana Dove, Thompson Hine's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager, pioneered an innovative process to recruit and retain minority and LGBTQ lawyers. The process is designed to eliminate bias and highlight important qualities and behaviors that predict success at the firm. Since adopting this process in 2017, Thompson Hine has increased its population of minority and LGBTQ lawyers by 50%. We feel the same process, or at least parts of it, can be used to recruit a diverse mutual fund board. All right, I'm going to turn to Andy. Andy, can you give us a little background on personality assessments and why they're widely used by some organizations?
I'd like to be part of this important conversation. There is a very popular field in psychology where social scientists, if you would, that's the terminology that I use, they conduct what is called personnel selection research, which is essentially the concept that job performance is a multi-dimensional construct. And that has been around for a very long time, maybe dating back to the 1930s, 1940s. But since the 1990s, there has been a resurgence of that type of research to identify the relationship between personality and job performance. And the breakthrough study really happened in 1991. There was one study that showed that there were 5 major dimensions of personality, if you would. They identify openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and one thing that is called neuroticism, which was a new word for me, but essentially it's about the mood of an individual. So essentially, some jobs would require someone to be more moody, if you would, than other jobs. But in any event, there have been many studies that have been conducted, and a lot has been said about the relationship between personality and performing on a job. But there are 2 foundational principles that personnel selection research has highlighted, and I want to share that with you just to give you a little bit of context. The first foundational principle is that personality constructs are more effective if you're predicting job performance using some sort of confirmatory process as opposed to exploring an idea, but you are actually validating an idea. You may have a concept of what is required, but you have a validation process in there to ensure that it's not just a conceptual thing, but it's an actual thing. And this is a little bit complicated, and frankly, it's outside of my area of expertise. But in talking to the consultants that we worked with, they apply what they call a validity coefficient to make corrections when they're looking at data to ensure that the data is ultimately reliable. I mean, that's essentially what they do. The second concept is that, some people often assume that an individual's personality changes frequently, and that's kind of an interesting question, because the research has shown that in any given situation, people's personalities actually don't change very much. What actually changes is the person's behavior, not so much the personality. And by personality, we are talking about a person's natural disposition, if you would, towards others. So in other words, you will see from context to context changes in the behavior, but from that behavior in different contexts, you will be able to see consistently certain personality traits. For example, someone who is people-oriented will likely show a people-oriented disposition across all contexts. He or she may be, outgoing and friendly with coworkers, maybe warm and nurturing with family, and outgoing and connecting with their friends. But you will see those personality traits showing in all different contexts. And that's essentially what assessments try to do, to get a better understanding of what those natural dispositions are. And these tools have been around for a while now. I think it's fair to say that outside of legal, Mike, these tools are used very frequently, particularly by professional services organizations and industries. In fact, I think what we've done at Thompson Hine was innovative, because I'm not aware of a single firm that was using assessments for recruiting purposes. I think most legal organizations, whether they are law schools, law firms, or legal agencies, they've used assessments for professional development as a professional development tool, not so much as a recruiting tool. Outside of legal, you will find them to be used quite often to identify individuals for high-performing positions like CFOs, COOs, maybe members of the board. They're quite popular in that context. In legal, we're starting to see a growing interest in the use of these, but I think it's going to take a little while to see them used in the way we used it, which is for recruiting purposes.
Okay, thanks. That's a great overview of assessments, and so the idea is to identify those specific behaviors that are going to contribute positively to the organization and to the board. And so, Andy, based on that, can you give us a description of Thompson Hine's program and the various components of it that make use of those assessments?
Yes, absolutely. So we have essentially 3 major tools that we use. We have a selection tool, which people refer to as a personality assessment or a personality questionnaire. We have a legal writing assessment, which we think is important, particularly when assessing a lawyer's writing skills. Lawyers write a lot, and that's a critical piece of the process. And then we have a behavioral interview component, and I'll explain all 3. I think it's important, just to stepping back for a second, the first step in developing our process, what we did was to develop what we called a peak performer profile for our lawyers. And this is essentially a conversation that we had internally in the firm about what it meant to be a successful lawyer. So we had to define success. And there is, of course, a lot of subjectivity that goes into that discussion, but we needed to start somewhere. We needed to define it in order to understand exactly the direction that we were going to be taking. And we settled on the idea, the concept that success, if you are on a partnership track at a law firm, it's becoming a partner. That's ultimately the goal. You are hired as an associate and you grow in your career, and then you become a partner. So that led then to have a close look at our partners to identify what are the traits that make them successful. So we had all of our partners take a selection assessment or a personality assessment. We then had a team of psychologists who look at the data to estimate a mean and a standard deviation so that we will be able to accurately compare everyone. And that means that by establishing a mean or a standard deviation, we would stabilize, if you would, the representation across the board. And then with that information, the team of psychologists that we used, they developed what is called a Similarity Index. Now, in some articles, you may see a reference to similarity profile. We purposely do not say profile because now in 2021, profiling has a very negative context, but a negative, people tend to react negatively to it. And so we use index because really what we're trying to do is to see how similar a potential candidate would be in terms of the personality traits to our partners, to those traits that our partners share. And so for every candidate, essentially we compare the results of their testing with this similarity index. And just to give you a little bit of context, the similarity index essentially is a numerical framework that goes from 0 to 100, where 100 represents nearly perfect similarity, and of course 0 represents no similarity. So everyone who takes our assessment is placed in that similarity index. Now, and while the similarity index is a proprietary part of our process, I think it's important to understand that essentially what it does, it subtracts points from 100 when the test taker differs or is different from the target profile, and points are then subtracted at a 2 or 1 ratio for important traits versus non-important traits, and that's essentially how it works. Now, we use a test that is called the PS16 or the 16PF. It's a tool that has been in place for a very long time. The actual name is 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire. This was originally published, I've been told, I'm not 100% sure, but our psychologists told us that this is a tool that dates back to the 1940s. And there is a recent version, which is the one we used, the 1994 version. And it's widely used by many industries. And essentially what it does is it assesses someone's score in the context of 16 personalities that we identified from that assessment that we get our partners that are critical for success. In other words, when we gave the partners the assessment of all the traits that could have been identified, we identified the top 16 traits. And there is a scale that identify the traits, let's say on the left, the 16 traits on the left, and then the very opposite of those traits on the right. And then there is a scale, and everyone is measured against that scale in the similarity index. And that's essentially how it is used. Now, we don't make hiring decisions solely based on the results of the similarity index. It's an important piece. But as I mentioned before, a critical component of this process is what we call validation. We need to validate the data. And the way we validate the data is by incorporating behavioral interviewing, which Mike, you mentioned earlier. We have what we call a structural panel interview process, meaning we have a panel of partners and talent management professionals that would meet with every single candidate for the same requisition, and they would ask the same questions to all candidates, and these questions are intended to essentially explore how similar or different these candidates are to the Similarity Index. We also have one-on-one interviews, and while people get to ask all types of questions during those interviews, like in any other interview, we do give the one-on-one interviewers very specific behavioral questions that come from the test takers' results in order to, again, explore those areas where maybe there might be a red flag or a concern from the testing to validate the result. We take then all of that data, including the results of the legal writing test, which really is not a behavioral thing. It's more of a skill issue type of tool for our lawyers. And we create a packet that we put together, and then we send it to the practice group leader of our firm with the recommendation as to who should be hired. Ultimately, the goal of this process is to give us as much data and information as possible about the candidate, so that we're not making decisions based on a 20-minute interview where, as the research has shown, particularly with one-on-one interviews, there is a greater chance that people will have implicit bias in assessing someone's qualifications based on the way they are able to connect with them. So to avoid that process, at least in an effort to minimize the impact of implicit bias, we have created this process which I just described.
All right. Well, thanks, Andy. That's quite a lot of information, and we'll go through and unpack some of the things that you've said in there. And I'm really happy that you mentioned implicit bias, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. So, one of the first tool part of the process is the assessment, and we used a specific test here at Thompson Hine, but other organizations may not have access to the test, may not have the resources to use the test. Are there other types of tools that a board in considering candidates could use to do that assessment?
Yes, I mean, having a tool just makes it a little bit easier, because it means that someone has already created a bank of traits that you can use from the tool to help you ascertain as accurately as possible the traits that make someone in that role successful. But you don't need a tool. I think ultimately what you need is a clear understanding of what makes a person successful in that role. And that is something that you can come up with by having discussions, internal discussions in your organizations with people that understand the business objectives of the organization, the objectives of the role. And I think that if there is a consensus of the things, of the traits, of the behaviors that make someone successful, you're really making significant progress. Very often what happens, Mike, is organizations, and we're not, in that sense, it's the same for us. When we think about a position, we think of that in terms of a job description. And then we put together all of the roles and responsibilities. But what tends to be ignored in creating a job description is beyond the actual functions, the creating reports, the making phone calls, and all of those components. It's the actual behaviors, the individual natural disposition to certain things that very often have an impact on someone's ability to be successful in that role. So having those conversations and having a clear sense of what makes a person successful beyond the responsibilities, we're talking personality traits, behaviors, it's a step in the right direction.
Okay, we received a question from the audience, and it's a very good question. And I think we have to, Andy, I'll tell you what it is, and the other participants what the question is. But I think we should set the stage in that, you know, the reason that we are using this process is to increase our representation of underrepresented groups in the firm. So the question is, you know, how diverse in terms of race and gender is the partnership? That will have an impact on research and the data as different races and genders respond to assessments differently. Is that taken into account? And my you know, this comment I made before reading that was, you know, the assessment was done prior to implementation of the program, so there were fewer, you know, for instance, Black lawyers in the firm at that time. So Andy, I don't know if we're going to redo the assessment at some point where it would take into consideration the behaviors of the new lawyers that have joined the firm.
Yes, assessments are an important piece of the process, but the most important part of the process, frankly, is the creation of that similarity index that I was talking about. And those need to be revisited, even if you have a diverse workforce. Every 4 to 5 years, that's typically the recommendation, because things change. You know, the industry changes, behaviors that were not perhaps relevant in the past are now relevant. And so it's important to make sure that that's index, or that list of personality traits, are as updated as possible. In our case, what we did when we were creating the Similarity Index, we had the team of consultants that we worked with to look at the population and to ensure that the index was representative from a diversity perspective, that it had the right number of women and racially diverse LGBTQ responses being embedded into the creation of the Similarity Index, precisely because there was that concern. So they essentially weighted the responses and weighted the assessment differently to ensure that they were collecting, they were building the similarity text with the need to ensure that it was representative of a diverse population. Now, I know this is very much in everyone's mind, because when you think about similarity indexes, or, you know, as they call it, similarity profiles, it's almost counterintuitive to think, oh, how can it help diversity? Aren't you looking for people who look like yourself? And if your workforce is primarily of one particular demographic or gender, aren't you replicating that same group of people? And I completely understand that sentiment, because it does sound counterintuitive. And you would ask yourself, you know, how can this actually help us? And for us, it was really listening to the consultants and reading the research, because the vast majority of the research suggests that actually, if done correctly, personality testing can help create a diverse workforce. And the concept is this: it's essentially the notion that that people in general, regardless of their background, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, whatever the differences or the demographics may be, they share in every one of those populations similar personality traits. You would find people who are you know, really happy with, you know, and friendly, and then you'll find people who are very moody. I mean, and in fact, the research and many commentators who've looked into this have said that they would strongly argue that to assume the opposite is in and of itself discriminatory. To think that, you know, the happy people belong to a particular demographic, it will be wrong. The research shows all of those traits are shared across the board, and by all of the demographics. And you're not looking for what you're looking for is actually the traits that make individuals successful in your organizations, and you can find those traits in any of those groups. Our consultants assured us that we would do better, and in fact, you know, that's exactly what we have seen. Now, I also want to mention that this issue of discrimination has been studied extensively, and so there are a number of studies out there for those of you who are interested. Back in the late 90s, there was a study that was done regarding individuals with disabilities, and the results were essentially that when on average, individuals with disabilities, for example, will have the same mean scores to individuals without disability. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, looked at that issue carefully and ultimately rendered a statement based on empirical data that when testing is designed to measure traits, there's really no risk of discriminating against any particular population. And there are research studies that have been done with respect to race, with respect to people over the age of 40. Consistently, every single time, the studies show that, in fact, if the focus is traits and behaviors, you will likely end up with a very opposite result, which is increasing the diversity of your workforce.
Yeah, well, hey, thanks for that explanation. And that's really great to focus on behavioral traits, which, as you said, span demographics. So we're talking things like compassion, cooperation, collaboration, all those kinds of things that boards hopefully value in new members. And so I'd like to also address what boards will often say, directors and trustees will often say, we want to pick someone with a good cultural fit. And I think that a lot of times they mean what you just said, how well they work together, how cooperative they are, how, the various behavioral traits, but sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes it's other things. Right. Are they like us? So could you just walk us through the behavioral interview in the panel question, because that really does sort of address the cultural fit issue.
Yes, in our panel interview process, there are a couple of things that we do to ensure that the conversation is really about identifying the behaviors and the traits, as opposed to creating a situation where people are connecting because they belong to the same demographic group, or they went to the same school, or they're that sort of thing, right? And one of the things that we do is the interviewers that are part of the panel do not have the resume or the details of the person's background. Or obviously, they get to see the individual, but they don't know what law school they went to, how they performed in terms of the grades. They don't know anything about them. They just have the person there in front of them, and they have their list of questions. The questions are assigned to each interviewer, so every interviewer knows already the questions that they're going to be asking, and those will be the same questions that they will be asking every other candidate for the same position. The other thing that we do is that we ask each individual interviewer to rate the performance. We have a scale, a metric. It's a scale to rate the performance during the interview. And every interviewer is asked to have their own individual personal rating score as they conduct the interview. That's important because people need to immediately react to what they've seen, and it's important that that is immediately reflected in a document where they note the score. Then, as part of our process, we also ask the panel, once the interview is over, to get together immediately after, not an hour later, 2 hours later, but right immediately after, to then come up with what we call a consensus score. And Mike, you've been a very important member of this process. And as you know, this is probably the best part of it, because if I scored someone low and you scored someone high, now we are being asked to agree on what the actual score is. And that leads to the best part of the process, which is you're talking to each other, you're discussing the scores, you're discussing what you saw, the behaviors, you're looking at the questions and the answers provided, which one seems to be relevant to what we're looking for. And people will disagree respectfully, obviously, but what the research has shown is that that type of conversation tends to remove any opportunity for discrimination on the basis of any of the issues that we would generally be concerned about. Because if you say something that would strike me as wrong, I'm going to call you on it, particularly if I'm on the other end of the fence, right? And so we try to have a good group of interviewers in that panel. We have partners who are very experienced. We have partners who are more junior in their experience. We have staff members with experience and an expertise in talent management. Everyone has been trained in our firm with respect to unconscious bias. So, all that plays into those conversations. And ultimately what you get, it's a really honest discussion on the person's behaviors and their likelihood to be successful at the firm. Because ultimately that's what you're looking for, that who is more likely than not to be successful at the firm. And that is, we're trying to quantify that assessment as much as we can.
Yeah, and Andy, you're right. I've done many of these interviews, and I think I just add a couple of important points to what you just said. One is that the panel that I'm on is the same panel, the same 3 people for every single interview. The person on the, I have the questions that I ask, the other panelists have the questions that they ask for every single candidate. So that consistency is very important. Second, the discussions after the interview sometimes last as long as the interview itself, because there is quite a bit of discussion about the responses and how we interpret the responses and what our thoughts are about the responses. And third, so as a result, we do indeed come to a consensus, and it's somewhat surprising how oftentimes we are in agreement on right away. There's sometimes where we are far apart. And third is that the questions that the panel asks the candidates have nothing to do with their expertise, their education, their prior jobs, where they went to school. They're all situational questions that are designed to elicit answers that indicate behaviors. So there'll be questions about when you stepped up because somebody dropped the ball on their duties. Tell us a time, what about when you had a situation when you had to mediate? What about a situation you had to do this? So there are those types of questions which really go to how you're going to function in the organization, and whether the way you're going to deal with the situation is consistent with the way that the organization would want someone to deal with the situation. So they're very useful that way, and totally eliminate any kind of bias, because as Andy said, we know nothing about the person at all. Andy, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I just want to mention that those are not easy questions to answer either. Those are questions that will force the individual to be thoughtful and to think about an event in the past that would be responsive to the question, because the underlying philosophy of these type of questions is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So we want them to give us examples of things that happened to them in the past that could suggest, hopefully, that they are a good fit for the organization, that they share in the traits that make lawyers successful at the firm.
Yeah, and I agree with you. They're really tough questions. I have to say, every time I do an interview, I always think, thankfully, I'm not on the other side, because they're tough. And we'll tell the person, you know what, these are tough questions, and if you need to take some time to answer it, feel free. Don't be self-conscious if you need to sit there for a minute and answer, because we understand and we don't take that into consideration. We just got a question, Andy. It says, if an organization desires to change the board's culture, have assessments been used to accurately identify candidates who align with the culture change being sought? That's a very interesting question.
Yes, and we actually dealt with that issue when we were putting together our process, because there are certain things that you would like to see in the culture of the organization. And the question is, should we also be tweaking our process to ensure that we are looking at those types of behaviors? And yes, the answer is absolutely. The one concern that is often raised when this type of question is raised is make sure that what you think it's a good cultural change or good behavior that would support a cultural, a change in the culture of the organization, in fact, will be good. I mean, right? Because sometimes we may think of something that will be great. I mean, very often people throw in, for example, the idea of innovation because it sounds great. Who doesn't want to be innovative? Well, but maybe innovation is may not be as relevant to an organization as it is for another organization. Perhaps for an organization, staying with practices that have been proven to be successful is what matters the most. But conceptually, if you are looking to implement changes in the organization's culture, you can for sure use these type of assessments to then search for the individuals that will share in the behaviors and the traits that you're looking to see in the organization in the future.
We received another question that says, when you test applicants against a personality index, do you end up with a short list of people with similar personalities? And I'll address that first, Andy, and then if you want to add to it, I think the answer is no. Excuse me, no, because everybody we test, everybody that we interview has a different personality, and what we look at it in large part is sort of the thought process in getting to the result. Because we ask people to and Andy, you're gonna have to help me out with this a little bit. We ask people to, in responding to their questions, to use what we call the STAR method, where when they answer the question, they like, what was the situation, what were the tasks that you had to do, what was the analysis, I think, with the A.
Yeah, it's specific, achievable. If it's the achievements.
And then the R is the results. So it gives us a view of how they tackled the problem or how they tackled the situation. And I have to say, we've had interviews where we disagreed with the outcome. We disagreed with the result that they got, or we disagreed. We didn't think that we just didn't think that was maybe the right result or the whatever. But we analyzed their process. We analyzed how they thought about it. What did they do? What were the considerations? And sort of assess them on that. So. Everybody deals with things differently.
Yeah, it's a great question because I think that's why I don't like to call them personality tests, because the presumption there is you're going to end up with people with the same personality, and that's not exactly what we're trying to do. I like the terminology that our consultants use, which is selection test. Because when you say personality test, it almost implies that you're looking for a specific type of personality, when in fact what you're looking is for behaviors. And you can have people with many different types of personalities. You can have a person who in his or her natural disposition is shy, and another person who in his or her natural disposition would be bombastic and very full of energy. And yet they share in the same behaviors when it comes down to delegating work and communicating effectively, or when the way they deal with conflict, even though in their personality they may be different in their behavior in particular context. In this case, the context of a job, they tend to behave the same way. And this is what I was saying earlier, that personality is stable, but what changes is the behaviors. And what we're looking is through questions that go to their behavior, if they share in those natural dispositions that we think are important for the organization. And those behaviors, you will see them across the board in any group. But I understand the question, because we keep saying personality testing, and it's almost like, oh, we're looking for the same personality, but no, we're focused on the behaviors And we think that personality does have an impact on how people behave. So obviously it's part of the equation, but it's not the focus of the analysis.
All right. Well, those were great questions, and it looks like we're out of time. So we're going to have to conclude today's chat. If you have any other comments, please enter them into the Q&A box now, or if you'd like to send them to Andy or to myself, please do so. We'll have another coffee chat this Friday, February 26th. Our colleague Cassandra Borchers will be discussing updates and considerations for Form ADV, which is the Investment Advisor Registration Form. She'll be joined by Julie Thomas from Fund Evaluation Group. To register for that chat or any future chat, visit the events page on the Thompson Hine website. That's also where you can find Andy's email or my email. Thank you for your interest in attending today's program, and thank you, Andy, for sharing your insights. When the webinar ends, you'll be prompted to take a survey providing feedback. This feedback is very important to us and will help us continue to tailor our programs to your needs. Thanks again. Enjoy the rest of the day and stay well. Bye.